Hello, hello. What is going on, guys? It is good to be back. This is the first live stream that I've done since I've returned from my recent dinosaur fossil hunting trip in Wyoming, which was massively, massively successful. For those of you that have not gotten any of the updates from that, the video, which is summarizing that entire trip and all of the findings and the scientific significance and everything like that, is mostly done at this point. We're just waiting on some lab results. It's been kind of a painful wait, but as soon as we get those lab results, just to confirm what we found out in the Wyoming Badlands, then I will for sure be uploading that video. So we were expecting to get the results last week, and we're still waiting for them now as of Thursday of this week. So that's the status of the Wyoming video. It's not like I've just forgotten about it. It's ready to go, just waiting for the confirmation of the results. But I thought, I would come back, do a nice, fun stream for my first stream back. So it was actually, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this one Christian apologist channel. But this is what actually inspired today's video. Is I came across a video from this Daily Dose of Wisdom guy whose channel has just really blown up over the last year or two. He's got 700,000 freaking subs, and he does these short little videos destroying atheism. And there are these two videos in particular where I saw Ben Shapiro and Stephen C. Meyer together in one video, and it says, there's apparently two versions. There's a 13-minute version, and if that version was just too long for the audience to be able to follow, there's a 9-minute short version in parentheses, which is just hilarious. But it's basically the same clip from the same interview video with Ben Shapiro and Stephen C. Meyer, where they say how the way that this channel here, the way that Daily Dose of Wisdom sells it, is how math destroys atheism, how math destroys materialism. Brilliant, points to God. I mean, like, he is really overselling this right here. But I thought, I had never seen this. I'm obviously aware of Stephen C. Meyer and Ben Shapiro, and I haven't done a video on either of them. So I thought, oh, this is perfect. We can get two birds with one stone. Let me just watch and debunk this interview. I mean, this sounded really fun to me anyways. Maybe it's a sick version of fun. But so yeah, let's just take a look at the full thing, not this crappy cut version from Daily Dose of Wisdom. I mean, this guy's like a complete hack, and he doesn't really add anything to any of his videos. He just shows you videos from others. So let's just go directly to the full interview with our boy Ben and Stephen C. Meyer. First of all, I just want to explain, for those of you who have no idea who the Stephen C. Meyer guy is, he's like one of the biggest creationists and Christian apologists for intelligent design out there. He's been on like Joe Rogan's podcast. He's been on the big tour. He does talks. He's like a director at the Discovery Institute, which is one of the very biggest creation science centers out there. It's like a big think tank. They've got a lot of political influence and everything. So this guy's kind of a big deal in the creationism world. So it's kind of surprising I haven't done a video on him yet. But, he basically repeats the same thing over and over again. So one video is probably all we'll need to debunk everything Stephen C. Meyer ever brings up. So yeah, let's just look at this video here, which is the full interview. It's only like less than an hour. So yeah, this is their interview here. We're just going to go ahead and just debunk all the incorrect things that they say. I have noticed, before we start really quick, this actually, I wanted to do a video specifically on like the pipeline of like the right-wing like podcast verse to pseudoscience like young earth creationism and flat earth and all the rest. It seems to me anyway that there is a direct pipeline from one to the other. This is one example here of Ben Shapiro interviewing Stephen C. Meyer, who's not a young earth creationist. He's an old earther. But still, I mean, intelligent design is also pseudoscience. So there is some sort of attraction of like right-wing podcast guys being attracted to pseudoscience. Candace Owens is the most recent example of this, because I don't know if you guys know, like, I wanted to make a video on this, but then it seemed like everybody had already beaten me to it and made a video on it, so I haven't yet. But Candace Owens announced that she was like officially going down the flat Earth rabbit hole. So yeah, if any of you are have any like right wing relatives or anything, check on your loved ones and make sure that they've been inoculated against pseudoscience, because it seems like just a prevalent slippery slope for a lot of these people. And Ben Shapiro here is going to be a good example, because he's often propped up by the right wing as like this, you know, paragon of logic, this boy genius, master rhetorician and debater. But so we will see exactly how he handles himself in this interview with one of the world's biggest creationists and you know, overall liar about evolution. Let's go.
So much for joining the Ben Shapiro Show.
Absolutely.
So let's start from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Because people are going to ask. So you talk a lot about evolution and science. Obviously, your books, Darwin's Doubt and Signature in the Cell, are both heavily scientific. So what is your scientific background, so folks know?
Heavily scientific. Oh, God. Okay, here we go.
Well, I started in double majored in physics and geology. And then I worked as a geophysicist for 5 years in industry. And
okay, let's just clarify, because he's kind of overselling himself for a second here. I worked as a geophysicist for 5 years in industry. What does that mean, Stephen? So I looked it up. So he got an undergraduate degree in what he was talking about. I don't know if that exactly makes him a geophysicist, but then he was employed by Arco, who nowadays is a franchise of gas stations. But I think when young Stephen, fresh out of his undergrad, was working there, that I think that he was mostly doing like seismic surveys and PowerPoint presentations. So, okay, if he wants to try to sell himself as a geophysicist from doing that work, it's a little bit of a stretch of the word, but okay, maybe I could give him that on a technicality.
And went from there to do the program in the philosophy of science, specifically philosophy of biology at Cambridge University, where my PhD dissertation was on the origin of life problem. Which was
okay, so yeah, that all seems to track from my research of Stephen C. Meyer. There is something that I should bring up, and that is, unfortunately, it seems like Stephen C. Meyer got his start in Dallas, which is where I'm from. That's my hometown. So really unfortunate that the kinds of things that Dallas seems to contribute to the world just do not seem to be very good. Hopefully yours truly being the exception, but like literally it was like the Dallas Rotary Club that picked him to get a scholarship to go to Cambridge to study as a, you know, a philosophy of science degree. And then he studied the origin of life from the perspective of a philosophy of science degree. So I don't know exactly what his thesis or dissertation was on, but yeah, I assume that it was not very apologist and everything that he's done since then. I assume that he was nice and covering up his apologist tracks back then.
It's a very interdisciplinary question. How did life first arise from presumably the non-living chemicals? So it had biochemistry, molecular biology, thermodynamics, information theory. It's a question that has lots of different subjects involved. So it's a very interdisciplinary PhD.
Okay, so with all of that said, if you go to your Wikipedia page, the first thing that it says is that you are the advocate of a pseudo-scientific theory called intelligent design.
Correct.
So let's start with a couple of questions on that. First of all, people suggest that you are a creationist. What is the difference between intelligent design, the argument for intelligent design, and creationism?
Right.
There's not one.
Well, creationism holds that it takes the Bible as the basis of the theory. So creationism is an interpretation or a deduction from religious authority, whereas intelligent design is an inference from biological and physical cosmological evidence. So the one starts from the data of the natural world, the other starts from scripture. The other difference is that most creationists hold to a view that the earth is very young. It was created maybe 10,000 years ago or something like that. ID itself is an age-neutral theory, but most of us hold the standard ancient dates for the universe and for life. So
what he just walked through is that he's an old Earth creationist. There's young Earth and old Earth creationists. So yeah, I mean, he is a creationist. He's trying to sort of distance himself from that and saying, oh, well, I am a follower of intelligent design, which means I'm data driven. But no, he's a Christian apologist. He's driven by the Bible. That's why he's an old Earth creationist. So this is just rhetorical obfuscation.
and planet Earth. So I'm an old Earth guy.
So the case that is generally made against intelligent design is the idea that it's not a scientific theory. So is intelligent design the idea that there was somebody, you don't actually say God, but something, there was some intelligent force that moved the universe, that created life on Earth, that was responsible in your book for the Cambrian explosion? How is this a scientific theory as opposed to just, as maybe Richard Dawkins would say, a God of the gaps argument?
Well, one of the things I did when I first set off to grad school, my story is that I encountered this information argument. One of the most extraordinary discoveries of 20th century biology is that at the foundation of life is information in a digital form. The DNA molecules store
digital form, Stephen?
Stores information in a 4-character digital code. And this discovery of Watson and Crick in the 50s has, over time, created an impasse in both chemical evolutionary theory, which are the theories about the origin of the first life, and theories of biological evolution as well, which are theories about how you get new forms of life from pre-existing forms. Because to build anything in biology, you've got to have code, you've got to have information.
Just so everybody remembers, right? This is him responding to a question of, why is intelligent design scientific? So this is his response so far. It has absolutely nothing to do with answering that question.
So I became fascinated with that question and the possibility that the information at the foundation of life is actually an indicator of the activity of mind, of an intelligence. But to determine whether or not that argument could be formulated scientifically, I had to dig in a little deeper into how scientists go about reasoning about these origins questions, about events in the remote past. And oddly, one of the people most helpful to me in that was Charles Darwin himself. Because in the 19th century, he and his mentor, Charles Lyell, the great geologist, developed a method for investigating historical scientific questions. And they had a principle of reasoning they called the vera causa principle, or the idea that if you want to explain an event in the remote past, you should posit an event or a cause which is known to have the powers to produce the effect in question. And
yeah, that is pretty logical. It's not just science that uses that principle. It's also like forensics, criminal justice, like just trying to figure out what happened when like a crime occurred. You have a crime scene, but you have no witnesses. You're going to have to use principles like that in order to reason about what happened. Or like history uses examples like that, uses this logic. This is not just like a scientific thing. This is just a good logical principle to use.
As I began to think about that, I realized that it was possible to formulate a case for intelligent design in a strictly scientific manner using the method of Lyell and Darwin. Because as we think about the origin of information, the one thing we know is that it always arises from an intelligent source, whether we're
no, it doesn't.
Talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or
a snowflake, like a spectrum from a distant star. The crystalline structure of quartz. I mean, like, there's tons of information all around us that does not derive from minds at all. In fact, I would say the vast majority of all information in the universe does not come from a mind.
Information embedded in a radio signal. Whenever you find information, especially
information embedded in a radio signal being emitted by a pulsar. Absolutely no mind involved with generating that information.
Especially if it's in a digital or alphabetic form, you trace it back to its source, you always come to a mind, not a material process.
Except for literally all the examples that I just went through. The pulsar is a great example. The pulsar is not a giant brain, Stephen.
So using the same scientific method of reasoning that Darwin used, I came to a different non-Darwinian conclusion, which was that there is...
Because you are wrong.
Evidence of intelligent design, not just what the Darwinians call apparent design in the history of life. So if our theory is unscientific, the Darwinian theory would be as well, but I think both are scientific.
No, yeah, your theory is just wrong because there are literally the majority of examples are counter examples to your argument. So that is the reason why Stephen's argument is wrong. I really hope that his entire interview is not just him making this same mistake over and over and over, but I kind of feel like that's what we're in for. But I don't want to judge Stevens too soon or anything. So we'll see. This is a live stream. I have not watched this entire interview yet. So we will see where this all goes and where this takes us. But yes, we are live. This is not a pre-recording. So if you got any super chats or anything that you want me to read out, I'm not going to be reading all of the comments right now in the live chat because I'm going to be looking at the video. But any super chats, I will spend time to highlight those. So let's continue.
Scientific. I just argue for one and critique the other.
So the philosopher of science, Karl Popper, has suggested that science is basically that which can be falsified. So,
ooh, Ben, wow, Ben Shapiro's kind of impressing me so far. I gotta admit, like, Ben Shapiro's questions have actually been pretty good. I mean, citing Karl Popper here, you know, he's little Benny boy winding his way to my heart a little bit.
What evidence would have to arise for the theory of intelligent design to be falsified?
You would have to.
Oh, see, exactly. Okay, actually, Ben has done a really good job here because everything that Stephen had just literally finished saying was a complete and utter dodge of the question that Ben had asked him, which was, why is intelligent design a scientific theory? And Stephen was just like, well, if everything, all information comes from minds, which it clearly doesn't, and that's not scientific, then my theory is scientific. So, and then, yeah, Ben is asking, well, what can falsify it? I actually love this from Ben. Like, it's weird. I'm actually like kind of like hyping up Ben right now. He's actually asking like good questions. So let's hear from Stephen. What can falsify intelligent design?
Defined an undirected process that was capable of producing information beyond a threshold that we have defined mathematically. There's
Wait. Okay, so but I already did that though. Like we listed several examples of undirected naturalistic processes with no minds involved that are involved in creating information, specified like functional information that is symbolic, the whole thing, everything that you wanted, like from like the radio, like the signals emitted by a pulsar, you can tell information like about the mass of the pulsar. It's like that information is embedded within that light burst signal. So yeah, I mean, it would seem like that would fit that threshold of it's information that's being communicated. It's got a meaning to it. You can tell the mass of the pulsar from this information. I mean, come on. Let's see if he's got more in the barrel than just this weak argument.
There's a amount of information that might arise by chance based on what are called the probabilistic resources of the universe. But if you get beyond that from an undirected process, that would falsify our claim that only...
I just falsified your claim then, Stephen. There you go. Like, he's referring to like Shannon information there, which is basically just like like a specified like order or pattern of information that has a very low probability of arising from chance. But like, still, I mean, like, this is not just Shannon information. Like, there's actual information that can be gleaned about the pulsar from the information in its light signal. So this is exactly the kind of example that Stephen was just asking for that falsifies his whole position.
Mind can produce that amount of information. There's also other ways of conceiving of what makes something a good scientific theory rather than Popper's idea. It's been critiqued by philosophers of science, typically a more...
okay, yeah, to be fair, I like Popper, but yeah, he's not the end all be all. I don't want to be overly critical of Stephen here. I'll be fair, there are other interpretations. Oh no, I'm so noobish. I'm sorry for the streamer mistake, guys. Let's see if I can get back to where we were.
Worldview.
Well, people have suggested that intelligent design advocates are anti-evolution, that they don't believe in the theory of evolution.
Go back a little bit.
One of the biggest, probably the biggest argument against intelligent design, obviously, is made by the new atheists. And
oh man,
life and the universe were designed, and that's something that you would also find affirmed. That's also simplistic. There are many really great questions. There's basically three different approaches to the interface between science and religious process that was capable of producing information beyond a threshold that we have defined mathematically. There's a amount of information that might arise by chance based on what are called the probabilistic resources of the universe. But if you get beyond that from an undirected process, that would falsify our claim that only mind can produce that amount of information. There's also other ways of conceiving of what makes something a good scientific theory rather than Popper's idea. It's been critiqued by philosophers of science. Typically, a more popular view among philosophers of science is that what scientists are really doing is they're making inferences to the best explanation. And that's how I framed the argument in Darwin's Doubt and in Signature in the Cell for intelligent design. A best explanation would be one that posits a cause, which is...
Okay, I'm just going to use spacebar to pause from now on to avoid what just happened. Apologies for the technical difficulties there, but does anybody also know what button on the keyboard to press that skips like 10 seconds forward in the video? I'm pretty sure there's just a button that you can press for that. That would make it a lot easier for some of these parts that are just going to be brutal suffering listening through.
Known to produce the effect in question, and in the best of cases where there's only one known such cause, and that's the kind of argument I make for intelligent design, that only intelligence, only mind is capable of generating the amount of information needed for these big jumps in biological complexity in the history of life.
So in the history of science and the philosophy of science, there's been this interesting battle between sort of religious folks who believe that religion should stay separate from science and folks who believe that religion and science are intertwined, and that on the one side, you have sort of the Thomas Aquinas that God and nature speak in the same language. And on the other side, you have the William of Ockham argument that basically God can do whatever he wants. And so what we don't want is a theory.
Okay. Now Ben's kind of overstayed his welcome now. He's kind of being too much of like over cerebral now. Oh, according to this and this and this. And, he just kind of making his little pompous citations. Just ask your question, Ben. Just ask it.
Theory of science that can disprove God. And the flip side of that is sort of Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping magisterial argument that science handles this stuff and religion handles this stuff, and there's no crossover. So where does intelligent design lie in that gap?
That's a really great question.
Okay, in the gap between science and religion, intelligent design is in the religion. It's in the pseudoscience category. There's not an overlap between it and science. There, question answered.
There's basically three different approaches to the interface between science and religious belief. One is the idea that the two are in conflict, and that was the kind of dominant view that came out of the late 19th century. Most historians of science now reject that. It's very simplistic. Another view is the Stephen Jay Gould view, is that science and faith occupy non-overlapping realms of inquiry. The Galileo aphorism was science tells you how the planets go, not how to go to heaven, or how the heavens go, not how to go to heaven. But the theory of intelligent design, I think, shows that that's also simplistic. There are many scientific questions and religious questions that are completely separate, but there are some questions that both science and religion speak to, and
not really. I mean, they're pretty separate. I would say. Well, one is going to get you spiritual questions answered, and one's going to get your empirical questions answered, and never the twain shall meet.
And my view is that when they speak to the same questions in the same way, that there is actually far more agreement than people realize. In fact, substantial agreement. For example, the origin of the universe, we now know, had a beginning, or the universe had.
Nope, actually, not known at all. Total lie, actually, and not even that's not a religious question either. I wouldn't say that's like more of a scientific question, but or like a philosophical question, maybe. But no, yeah. We don't actually have any evidence or reason that indicates that the universe did have a beginning. So he's simply incorrect with that one. But it's a common misconception. So
at a beginning, and this is one of the first words of the biblical text, that there was a beginning. So that's a point of agreement about the same issue. Is the universe finite or infinite?
Well, no, there actually is no consensus in science about whether or not the universe had a beginning or not. We know that there was a Big Bang and inflation, but what was before then, and if that was the beginning or not, is unknown. The universe could have been past eternal. It's still unknown.
Both science and religion are now telling us the same thing, that the universe had a beginning.
Nope.
Intelligent design is telling us that life and the universe were designed. And that's something.
Well, maybe intelligent design is telling us that, but that's not what science is telling us.
Something that you would also find affirmed in the theistic religious traditions. So that's a point of agreement.
Oh, I agree that it's a point of agreement between intelligent design and the theistic worldviews. I wonder why that is. It's almost as if intelligent design could just be Christian apologetics.
About a special question, in this case, about the origins of life. So I don't say that science and religion they have many areas of specialized inquiry. There are different questions that each address, but there are overlapping areas of interest. And increasingly what we found is that there is increasing agreement as we understand the science better, and as we get better, more sophisticated biblical interpretation sometimes as well.
Wait. Get better, more sophisticated biblical interpretations? Oh Lord. Okay, so yeah, back in the Iron Age, when people were reading the Bible as like a flat Earth geocentric text, that was just because those were stupid people. They didn't know how to read what the Bible was really saying. It was really a heliocentric text. It was really, perfectly in line with everything. It's talking about billions of years, not the 6 day stuff. That's all. You got to read between the texts. You got to have a more sophisticated interpretation. I mean, come on, dude. Come on. I mean, this is completely ad hoc reasoning to just try to warp what the Bible means to try to fit it when the Bible is clearly just contradicting what we have learned scientifically is the reality of our universe. There's a conflict here, and you're trying to, at one hand, dismiss any science that you can't. Especially you're basically doing mental gymnastics to warp your religious views to fit the science. But even then, sometimes it's so mismatched, it still doesn't fit. So you just have to reject the science and substitute your own petty straw man that you pretend is science and pass it off when in reality, it's just window dressing your religion. That's all intelligent design is.
One of the biggest, probably the biggest argument against intelligent design, obviously, is made by the new atheists. And it's fascinating to watch the crossover between neo-Darwinian thinkers and new atheists. They basically are the same group of people.
They're the same group of people.
Oh, God, with the neo-Darwinians. Oh, my God. Neo-Darwinism was a specific movement within the history of biology that ended in the 70s. Like come on, get over it. We're past Neo-Darwinism. We're past that point in time. We have so much knowledge about evolution now that is not contained within like Neo-Darwinism or the modern synthesis or anything. Like we know so much now of like epigenetics, niche partitioning, like sexual selection, drift. Like there's so much stuff that we know now. Like Neo-Darwinism is not the current consensus, and yet these guys are just building it up like a straw man to pretend like it is.
And so it seems to me that
no surprise, because Dawkins said, that Darwinism makes it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, and also the Darwinian view, the strictly Darwinian view, is not just the idea of evolution as change over time.
There were also plenty of intellectually fulfilled atheists before Darwin. I mean, come on, you've had atheists going all the way back to like ancient India.
Time, but the idea of an undirected, unguided process that produced the appearance, but not the reality of design. So they see nature essentially as being a self-creating entity that can produce all the wonders of and intricacies of living organisms without any guiding hand whatsoever. And so that lends itself to a strictly materialistic or atheistic worldview.
Well, people have suggested that intelligent design advocates are anti-evolution, that they don't believe in the theory of evolution. So what does the theory of evolution say, to start? And then what in it is an argument too far?
Do not ask this man right here what evolution says. He is like has absolutely no training or education in evolutionary science of any kind. He went through all of his actual credentials. None of them involved studying anything about evolution. Ben, what are you doing? Why are you asking him what evolution is? He's not an expert.
That's a great question. The term evolution is a term that has multiple meanings. So if you want to avoid the fallacy of equivocation, it's really good to define terms right from the beginning. So the first meaning is change over time. Obviously, and that can mean a couple different things itself. It can refer to the small scale variation that we see with...
Oh, this guy is giving me like tweaker energy. I don't know if anybody else is getting that, but some of his like expressions and just the way he's talking. I mean, we're listening at like 1.25 speed, but he keeps making like these really big eye motions. It's like I'm getting major tweaker energy from this.
With things like the Galapagos finches, where their beaks get a little bigger, a little smaller in response to varying weather conditions. It can also refer to the fact that life on the planet today is different than it was in the period of the Jurassic, when you had the dinosaurs roaming the Earth, or in the Cambrian, when you had trilobites.
So this guy, I think he does accept the Jurassic and the Cambrian. I really don't know, actually. I don't know what his weird beliefs are with that stuff. Somebody let me know in the comments.
We've had change in the representation of life forms over time in the fossil record. Nobody doubts either of those meanings of evolution. Second big meaning of evolution is the idea that all forms of life are connected by common ancestry.
Yeah, wait. Nobody doubts that we have life changing over time in the fossil record? Is that what I just heard? Like, let me go back. I thank you guys for letting me know what the letters are for going back. I appreciate it.
Response to varying weather conditions. It can also refer to the fact that life on the planet today is different than it was in the period of the Jurassic.
True.
When you had the dinosaurs roaming the Earth, or in the...
Okay, so he does seem to acknowledge that in the Jurassic was when the dinosaurs were roaming the Earth.
Cambrian, when you had trilobites.
Okay, trilobites in the Cambrian. I got my trilobite right here with me. You guys see an Axamander here? My pride and joy. Yeah, I love trilobites. Although he's not from the Cambrian. This is a trilobite from the Devonian. Neither here nor there.
We've had change in the representation of life forms over time in the fossil record. Nobody doubts either of those meanings of evolution. Second big meaning of evolution.
Okay, so changes over time in the fossil record. Okay, so that basically gives us evolution all the way from like stromatolites, single-celled organisms, all the way through the Cambrian dinosaurs, and the whole works. So like, it sounds like he's accepting evolution so far.
Is the idea that all forms of life are connected by common ancestry back to a single ancestral form.
Wait, is Stephen Meyer's a theistic evolutionist? That's what I just heard. And like, I did not think that he was a theistic evolutionist. Like, does he think that things did evolve and it was just God directing it instead of random mutations? Is that really his whole position? Because that was not my understanding at all.
Single one-celled organism. So Darwin represented that idea with his concept of the tree of life. That's an idea of evolution that's consistent with the idea of intelligent design. Those many intelligent design proponents and other scientists, including evolutionary biologists, are getting increasingly skeptical about it because there's so much...
No, they're not, man. Come on. Why do you feel the need to actually just lie like that? Come on.
Evidence of discontinuity in the fossil record, and discontinuity in the study of genomics, where we have things like orphan genes, which are big classes of genes that are unique to certain taxa and don't show any similarity to other genes anywhere else in the in the genome.
But we see orphan genes evolve as well. Like, it's not like a huge mystery, like how they can arise.
Databases. So you have this sense of, genetic information popping into existence in different classes of organisms.
It's called a mutation. Yeah.
Discontinuity.
Convergent evolution. It's not. These are all well understood mechanisms, Stephen.
Third meaning of evolution is the one, though, that's really contentious.
Oh, okay. This is the one that's contentious. Okay, let's see what he disagrees. What evolution do you disagree with, Stephen? Because it kind of sounds like he agreed with all of it.
And that's the idea that natural selection and random mutation are sufficient to produce all the new forms of life and the appearance of design that living forms manifest. So,
well, okay. Well, we don't really go with that anymore in science. There's more. There's like drift. There's selection. There's like epigenetics, again, niche partitioning. There's so much stuff beyond just mutation selection. Like we've moved past the 19th century. I don't know where Stephen has been, but we have been progressing in science.
It's an unguided process that produces the appearance, but not the reality of design. And that's the meaning of evolution that the theory of intelligent design is challenging. There's some intelligent design proponents may be skeptical about common descent, others are not, but it's that third meaning that unites us. And it's what the theory of intelligent design is about. We're challenging the idea that purely undirected processes can produce the complexity or the information necessary to build the complexity of living.
I mean, guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but like that literally just sounds like theistic evolution, right? Like that doesn't sound like intelligent design or old earth creationism. I thought intelligent design meant that life was intelligently designed separately. Like there's not evolution. There's not you didn't go from a single cell to evolve into biodiversity today. It was separate trees. I thought that's what intelligent design was this whole time, guys. But Stephen Meyer is trying to tell me that actually intelligent design only means that there's no abiogenesis and that actually just God created the first cell and then they all evolved there. And nobody even argues about the order of the fossil record and what it clearly shows about evolutionary change over time. Like, wow, this is all new to me, Stephen. It's weird.
Living organisms.
So you make a couple of arguments in your two books, Darwin's Doubt as well as Signature in the Cell. One is a DNA-related argument, one is a fossil record-related argument, but they go back, as you say, to that theory of evolution that suggests that natural selection and genetic mutation are enough alone to lead to the way that life has developed over time. I'm wondering if you can start by spelling out where is the discontinuity with regard to the establishment of life?
Well, the first big discontinuity is the origin of life itself, which is what my first book, Signature in the Cell, addressed. And many people don't realize that Darwin himself never addressed the question of the origin of the first life.
Yeah, because it's not part of the theory of evolution.
He speculated about it in a letter to a friend, but this was not something he addressed in The Origin of Species. He presupposed the existence of the first living cell. And there's a major discontinuity between chemical processes that we observe and what we see in actual living organisms. And it's a complexity gap that's absolutely extraordinary. We've got tiny miniature machines. We have not only the DNA with the digital code in it, but a complex information processing system, and even the simplest living cells on Earth. So that's
okay. Life is complicated. Yes. Incredible. Wow. It's not like, again, complication is not, you can get complicated things from non-designed, non-mind driven processes. This is replete with examples throughout the natural world. I've gone into many before. There's nothing about complexity that necessitates a mind or a designer.
It's a big discontinuity. There's a series of discontinuities in the fossil record as we find greater and greater complexity arising over time. One of the big ones that I talked about in Darwin's Doubt was one that bothered Darwin a great deal, which was what we now call the Cambrian explosion, which is the origin of the first major groups of animals in the fossil record.
Well, except for the other major groups of animals in the fossil record that evolved before the Cambrian, like Cnidaria, like jellyfish, sponges, porifera, big major groups of animals, which predated the Cambrian explosion. Wow. It's almost like our understanding of the Cambrian explosion is no longer as cut and dry as it was back in the 70s, where Stephen Meyer was reading about this probably.
Were tested in the Middle Cambrian in particular, and many groups of animals exemplifying completely new body plans arise in a very narrow window of geologic time.
Very narrow window of geologic time is like what, 25 million years? I mean, it's not very narrow. There's like a famous paper that talks about how long it would take to evolve an eye. And they did it's literally, I think the name of the paper is like a pessimistic view of the evolution of an eye. So they have like literally just a pessimistic view of like, if everything went wrong, how long would it take you to evolve an eye? And they concluded it could take like under 1 million years. So we have 25 million here there's plenty of time. It's not like you're lacking on time. And there are also, again, like we said, it's not just coming out of nowhere where you have nothing and then the Cambrian explosion. You've got a lot of precedents. There are a lot of life forms and animals in the Ediacaran before the Cambrian period that have lots of life forms. Like they're not working from scratch. They're working from other body plans.
Very abruptly, without discernible connection to ancestral precursors in the lower Precambrian strata.
Not really true. There are discernible connections. Like for trilobite, for example, you can look at like Spergina, looks just visually pretty similar. Like just overall, when you squint your eyes, it kind of looks exactly like a trilobite. There are some slight differences in the body plans, but like, again, not major ones. And if you look at, I think Eulingia maybe, there's a type of worm in the Ediacaran that it has a segmented body that's segmented in the same way that trilobites are segmented. So look at that. There's a body plan from before the Cambrian explosion. It's almost like not all this stuff came out at the same time. And it's actually not the kind of big discontinuity that Stephen Meyer is kind of lying to make it seem like.
And that's one of the big discontinuities in the history of life. There are many others. I've written an article with a German paleontologist, Gunter Beckley, about 17 such major discontinuities.
How many do you want to bet are actual discontinuities? Because like there are some actual discontinuities in the fossil record that you could point out where there are still gaps in our knowledge where, paleontology is not complete. It's not finished yet. We're still finding stuff. There's going to be gaps. But like how many of those 17 do you think are actual gaps, or they're just Stephen Meyer blowing up smoke like he has been in the last 2 minutes here?
The mammalian radiation, the origin of
the mammalian radiation, we have a lot of those fossils, especially since like the 90s and 2000s. We've gotten a lot of those.
Flowering plants, the first winged insects.
Flowering plants, again, see my video about transitional fossils, and I cover flowering plants in there.
Insects, the first dinosaurs, most of them.
The first dinosaurs too, Eoraptor. Like I've covered this on my previous videos about transitional fossils. Like these are not the giant discontinuities that he's making them out to be. Like maybe we thought that back 50 years ago.
Major groups of living forms on Earth arise discontinuously. So that's a big deal. The even bigger question, though, that I address in the book is, apart from that discontinuity, which is a puzzle for Darwinism, how would you build those organisms? What process could account for the origin of all that new form?
Mutation, selection, drift, etc.
Especially now that we know you need information, the information in DNA and from other sources.
The information comes from mutation, Stephen.
To build complex new forms of life.
Let's talk.
It comes from mutations.
About information theory. So for folks who haven't read your books, don't know anything about information theory, why does information theory suggest that there must be some sort of designer? Obviously, people like Dawkins who suggest that evolution
it does not.
Is the universal acid. They say that these things can arise by themselves. They would also make the suggestion that the information in DNA is not necessarily directed, that it only seems directed to us because we're here to actually look at the direction in which it moves. It could theoretically be random. What does information theory have to say?
Well,
I'm not sure what Ben actually means by that, though.
It's actually helpful first to go back to the molecular biological revolution of the 1950s. Watson and Crick discover in 1953, they elucidate, rather, the structure of the DNA molecule. They discover it's got this beautiful helix structure. There's these 4 chemical subunits that run along the interior of the helix called bases or nucleotides.
Hey, so far, he's actually given a pretty good... Oh, you can't really see my DNA helix back there, but I got a cool, like, elementally accurate DNA helix behind me.
Bases. In 1957, 1958, Crick, who was interestingly a code breaker in World War II, posits what's known as the sequence hypothesis, which is just a breakthrough moment in the history of biology, where he realizes...
Wow, the guy that was trained to hammer nails finds something that he thinks looks like a nail that he can hammer. Shocking.
That the nucleotide bases on the inside of the double helix are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language.
Except they're not. They're actually not, because there is no written language that's anything like DNA code. That's not how languages work. That's not how DNA works. They're not communicating like it's a language.
Or what we now think of as like the zeros and ones in a section of software code, which is to say it's not the physical or chemical properties of those bases that is important to their...
But it is, though. It literally is the chemical properties, the physical chemical, the electrostatics of each of the bases in the codon that determines how they bind to the tRNA, that determines the identity of the amino acid in the end protein. it literally, like, oh my, I have to go back because that was just like such a huge lie he just said.
Like alphabetic characters in a written language, or what we now think of as like the zeros and ones in a section of software code, which is to say it's not the physical or chemical properties of those bases that is important to their function, but rather it's their sequential arrangement in accord with an independent code, which was later elucidated and we now call the genetic code.
Oh, it's literally both though, Stephen. Like, it's literally both. Like, yes, like the sequence does actually matter, but the actual properties of each of those bases, the chemical properties, the electrostatics, how their electric fields are distributed in space, that matter when they interact with the tRNA. It's a physical interaction that depends on the physical properties of both of the chemicals interacting. It's a physical interaction between the tRNA and the codon of the mRNA. So like, what he just said is emphatically just plain wrong. I mean, maybe this is what happens when you have like a philosopher trying to talk about biochemistry here when he's never, I don't think he's ever taken a biochemistry class. He took like geophysics classes in undergrad and then took philosophy of science classes in his graduate school.
So what we have is a true information-bearing system that is expressing information as it happens for building the proteins and protein machines that cells need to stay alive. So in Seattle, where I live, we've got.
Okay, and when a pulsar sends a light signal, it's encoding the information, encoded into the sequences of photons, and they're in their frequencies is encoded in information about all kinds of things about the mass and the orbital dynamics of the pulsar. Like all of that is just is symbolically encoded. I mean, come on, like it's the same thing as what he's saying.
Great information companies.
And there's no mind involved in obviously generating the pulsar signal.
We've got Microsoft, which writes code. We've got Boeing and other manufacturing companies that use code. And there's a process called computer-assisted design and manufacturing, CAD/CAM, where an engineer might write some code would go down a wire, be converted into another machine language that could be read by a manufacturing apparatus, and that information will then direct the construction of a mechanical system. If you're at Boeing, it might put rivets exactly in the right place on the airplane wing. So you've got and the same thing that's going on inside the cell.
The same thing is absolutely not going on inside the cell. Like there's nothing in the DNA that tells you when to generate a certain protein, where to send it, how, like there's not information about how to fold it into what three-dimensional structure. Like all of this information is causally dependent on biochemical processes that are happening outside of the nucleus where the DNA is contained. So the DNA is not containing information for any of this stuff. That makes it completely unanalogous to the engineering example that you just gave, where it's telling it exactly where to put each little rivet in its structural formation. There's no analogy there. It's completely broken as an analogy.
You've got information directing the construction of proteins and protein machines that are absolutely necessary for survivability. So the big question is, where does that information come from? And also, what kind of information is it?
Well, like we just went over, only part of that information is even contained in the genome, in the nucleus. Like inside the genome, like the DNA basically is containing the information for like the supplies. It's like blueprints for the supplies to build a building, but it doesn't tell you any information about how to put those supplies together to make a building. Like all of that information is coming from biochemical processes just in the cytoplasm and the cellular membrane. Nothing to do with the DNA. So like not even all the information in Stephen's analogy, it's so broken. It's so wrong. This just hurts physically.
And that's where the information theory comes in. In the late 40s, there was a scientist named Claude Shannon who developed a mathematical theory of information. But his theory only captured, his theory of information had to do with the reduction of uncertainty, which he showed was inversely related to probability. More improbable an arrangement of characters, the more Shannon information that was carried.
True.
But his notion of information didn't capture the notion of meaning or communication function.
Sure, but again, like we can give examples that do.
So you could have a series of characters that were basically gibberish, but because they were aperiodic and random, you couldn't really tell whether they were meaningful or not. But they had a big information measure.
Sure, but we can give examples of information that does contain meaning, like the light from a pulsar or from a star with spectroscopic information. Like there is meaningful information that's generated without a mind directing the process at all.
So Shannon didn't capture the difference between functional or meaningful information and just an improbable arrangement of characters.
But I just did.
So it's actually not information theory, but it's information theory plus a qualitative judgment about what the sequence is doing that allows us to recognize the kind of information that we're familiar with in our own parlance. But the dictionary talks about variable.
Yeah, no, sure. You need an actual receiving apparatus in order to tell what is information. Like, if you said something to me in Chinese, like, I'm not going to be equipped to be able to get the meaningful information out of what you just said because I don't speak Chinese. If I like look up into the sky and I see the pulsar signal, well, I can't do anything with that because I don't have the necessary device in order to measure that in a way that I can then use that information to meaningfully tell information about that pulsar. I need the specific equipment. And it's the same way with DNA. There is no meaning in any of the information in DNA unless you have the proper machinery to read it. You need like an RNA polymerase, or you need like a ribosome or something that you need a complementary apparatus in order to derive meaning. All meaning is like this. But again, so is the meaning from naturalistic, non-mind directed sources like the pulsar.
Sequences of characters for conveying a meaning or a function. And that's what we have in DNA. And Francis Crick was very clear on that from the beginning. He said, it's not.
And that's what we have in pulsars. That's what we have in all kinds of natural processes without minds involved.
Here's Shannon information. It's information that's functional. And that's the kind of information that in our experience always indicates the prior activity of intelligence. If it's just a random arrangement, might be undirected processes. But if it's very specific and complex, and it's operating in accord with a symbol convention, then you've got information that is the product of mind.
No, you don't. And I just provided multiple examples that show you clearly that that is not the case and that that conclusion does not follow from the evidence or premises.
So this is where we get into the theories of probability, because the question becomes, could there have been such a strand of DNA that comes about by chance? Because the theory, obviously, as you mentioned, of evolution suggests that it's mutations now in the DNA that create all of the change in human life over time. So we'll skip the origin of life.
Huh? What did Ben just ask? Can you have a random string of DNA just come about? Like, is he talking about within the context of, I mean, he mentioned human evolution. So is he just talking about evolution? And can you mutate to get new functional information? Yes, Ben. Yes, you very much can. And we've seen countless experiments demonstrating that in real time.
Probably just a second. And then we'll but when it comes to the information string in the DNA, the contention is basically that given enough time, you run the experiments enough times, and eventually you will end up with an evolution that, and combined with natural selection, it preserves the mutations that are good, and you will end up with something that looks designed even though it is not designed. The mutation over time being preserved by natural selection is enough. Why doesn't that work?
Boom. Actually, that was a good question. Why doesn't that work? I'd like to hear Stephen's response, because guess what? It does work. So let's watch Stephen lie through his teeth.
There's a mathematical problem, and it's a profound one.
Okay, we got a profound mathematical problem. Okay, busting out the mathematicians. This explains why every mathematician I know rejects evolution. Oh, wait, no, wait. I'm confusing mathematicians with young Earth creationists. My bad.
My colleague David Berlinski calls it the combinatorial problem.
Oh God, David Berlinski. Oh God. For those of you that don't know, like, I literally do not understand David Berlinski at all, because he works at the Discovery Institute. Like, this dude is that guy's boss. So yeah, he's like, my colleague, David Berlinski. Yeah, it's just like they work together. David Berlinski's a super weird case because, like, I don't even know if he's Christian. I have no idea. But he works at the Discovery Institute, but he rejects intelligent design. I don't know how, guys. I do not understand this man. Maybe he's just a clout chaser. He just wants to be a contrarian. He's just a grifter in it for the money. I don't know. But he rejects intelligent design, but works at the Discovery Institute and also rejects evolution. It makes no sense, and his arguments are really stupid and flawed. Let's see if he gets brought up.
Or the problem of combinatorial inflation. Maybe simple analogy, way to get into it. We know from our experience with software code, writing and using it, that the last thing you want in a section of functional software code is a series of random changes to those zeros and ones. If that happens, you're going to degrade the information that's in that code long before you'll ever generate a new software program or operating system.
Yeah, if only that were analogous to the situation here with DNA, but it's not, because it doesn't reproduce and in the population of differential fitness effects over time. So sorry, it's not analogous.
And Richard Dawkins and many, many others, biologists, have acknowledged that what we have in DNA is akin to machine code, or as Leroy Hood puts it,
No, it's not.
digital code.
It literally is not. There's no if-then statements at all in the genetic code.
It's functioning in exactly the same way.
It's not at all, like I just pointed out.
So what we've learned from software writing and using is highly relevant to understanding whether or not the mutation selection mechanism would actually could generate conceivably or realistically new information. And there's a reason that changing software at random invariably degrades the information before you get anything useful and new. And that is because there's so many more ways to go wrong. In any system of digital or typographic or alphabetic communication, there are vastly more ways of arranging the characters in question that will generate gibberish than there are ways of arranging those same characters that will generate something functional.
I mean, true. Technically, it really depends on what kind of function, because some functions are much more sequence robust than others. But generally true. I mean, generally, most changes that you're going to be able to make to the sequence of a protein are going to be detrimental towards its function. Not all of them. We certainly have tons of examples to the contrary, but sure, most of them are going to be detrimental because, again, like, evolution and natural selection tend to stabilize populations on fitness peaks. And when you move away from the fitness peak, stabilizing selection brings you right back, because most changes that you're going to make are going to be taking you down from that peak. That's literally how it works.
So if you start randomly changing things, you're overwhelmingly more likely to find a gibberish sequence than a functional one.
True.
And as we've actually tried to quantify that, how much more likely, the quantitative odds are prohibitive. There's a
That's where you're incorrect and doing math wrong.
scientist who worked for 14 years at Cambridge University, Douglas Axe.
Douglas Axe, who he just tried to pass off as some sort of, rigorous, source or whatever, also a Discovery Institute employee. So yeah, not doing great. Douglas Axe paper was specifically calculating, like, what are the odds of getting this one specific sequence for this one specific enzyme, which he said doesn't have, I don't think that he made it very robust. Like, there's a lot of polymorphisms for most of these sequences where, like, you can change one amino acid for another, swap one for an out, and it doesn't really affect the function that much. Like, there's a very wide variety, a diversity of different types of, like, different forms of the same enzyme doing the same job that have a little bit of different sequences, and they can, they do the job relatively well. I mean, there's different levels to how well they do the job. I mean, you have a variability. That's kind of the whole deal with evolution. So again, basically David Axe's research that he's pulling on here, it was a paper, I believe it was peer reviewed and published, but it was basically like a mathematical thought experiment, and it was not in the way that evolution even works. Like, the way that his mutations worked was that just big chunks of 10 base pairs at a time would just randomly mutate. Like, no, that's not how evolution works. So already your little thought experiment is not going to be analogous to evolution. Let's see what Steven says about it, because I don't know where he's going to go with this.
His PhD at Caltech, went on to do a long-term molecular biology research postdoc at Cambridge to try to quantify this question. How rare or common are the functional sequences that would make a new protein, or a new gene capable of making a new protein? How rare are the functional ones in comparison to the non-functional ones? And for a relatively short protein, about 150 amino acids long, he determined that the ratio of functional to non-functional sequences was about 1 over 10 to the 77th power. Now, to put that in context, there are only 10 to the 65th atoms in the Milky Way galaxy. So what that means is that a random search for a new functional sequence is going to be like looking for one marked atom among 10 trillion, it'd be 1 trillion galaxies of the size of the Milky Way. So, and what turns out that even 4 billion years of life's history is not enough time to solve a search problem of that magnitude. And I go into all the math of this in the book, and it's pretty straightforward. There's only 10 to the 40th organisms in the history of the planet, not enough replication events to search a space 10 to the 77 big. So you're looking at, even in the whole, if you take the whole history of life on the planet into account, you're only going to be able to search a tiny, tiny fraction of the total relevant sequences. So you got a really big haystack, really small number of needles, and very little time to look for them. The bottom line is it's overwhelmingly more probable that such a search will fail than succeed in the known time of life on planet Earth, which means that the mechanism is more likely to, the hypothesis that the mechanism produced new information is more likely to be false than true.
And so the results of
Okay, so there's just one problem with that math, and that's that it's entirely wrong. So, and we actually have definitive proof against this, because we've literally watched what he's saying is mathematically impossible happen in front of our eyes. So let's go through that a little bit. So yeah, he's relying on Doug Axe, and who's again a Discovery Institute publisher. So then, yeah, basically Axe made some faulty assumptions by having big blocks of 10 mutations, of 10 base pairs mutations at once, which it just ignores the way that mutations actually happen in real life. So it's already a bad model that doesn't simulate real life at all. But then secondly, it completely ignores like the amount of polymorphisms, which is what we were talking about earlier, which is like the number of different ways that different enzymes can do the same job. And it just completely ignores that. And polymorphisms was literally the solution that solved the weighting problem, like the Haldane dilemma, which is basically what he's talking about. What he's talking about right here is kind of colloquially known as the waiting time problem. And it was first posited in it was posited in the 50s, solved in the 70s by Kimura's neutral theory, which has, been the consensus solution for this issue since the 70s. So Stephen Meyer really should be aware of this, that he's bringing up a problem that was solved 50 years ago. So I have no idea why he thinks that this is an issue. Let me just briefly provide an example of what I'm talking about. Let me present my screen here, pull up the original paper, right, that he was talking about, so I can show you guys. Because I think that this is really the crux of his argument. So can you see my screen here? Okay, perfect. So this is the original paper that he's talking about from Doug Axe. So estimating the prevalence of protein sequences adopting functional enzyme folds. So enzyme folding. Okay, so not even the sequence at this point. He's talking about the actual folding. So yeah, he's talking about how important protein folding is, how important tertiary structure is. Like, since tertiary structure is needed for enzyme activity, we want to see, how many possible different how many different sequences can get you functional folds. And he's proposing that, it's really, really bad because it's only 10 to the 77, and that's just such a huge number. And there's only, he was only considering this one specific active site as being like the target, right? In the numerator for his probability, right? The numerator is the specific sequence that is required to do this enzymatic function. And the issue is that he's only considering one specific tertiary fold as being like the only thing to have in the numerator, and he's ignoring all the robustness that you can actually have. So now let's look at an actual scientific experiment showing exactly what Stephen Meyer said could not be shown because there's not enough time in the history of the universe. Let's have an actual evolution of a new tertiary structure in a protein. Wow. It's like literally exactly what Stephen Meyer and Doug Axe's paper said was mathematically impossible. He said that this is a mathematical issue at the heart of evolution, that you could not have the evolution of new functional tertiary structures in protein sequences because there's not enough time in the universe for such a mutation to occur, because the amount of functional sequences is so small compared to the total amount of sequences. Well, right here, this paper in the real world shows that that is completely false and not reflective of reality. So let's see what they did here, right? So they basically have this RNA polymerase ribozyme, right? So they've constructed this ribozyme for the purposes of some various biochemical tests. So this is what they've started with. And they've then induced random mutations into this sequence, right? So they've just stimulated it to just have mutagenesis, just start mutating like crazy. Let's see what happens. And what they actually found was that a completely new tertiary structure evolved, like a new structure in the enzyme that improved the activity of the ribozyme. It literally made it a better enzyme. It increased its function by adding an entirely new tertiary structural fold that changed the actual orientations of the active site of the enzyme. So this is exactly what all these creationists have been saying is impossible. The information can't just come from mutation. The information has to, here it is. Here it is. They literally induced random mutations and found that some of those mutations added information into the sequence information here that actually increased its function and added an entirely new tertiary structure to the protein. So there's a real life example disproving exactly what Stephen Meyer said was literally a mathematical impossibility of evolution. And he thinks that he's disproved evolution using math. Then literally when we've just in real life in the lab shown that what he's saying is complete nonsense. In addition to on the actual, blackboard, just shown that his math is wrong as well.
This is, as you say, that it's more likely that it's designed than that it was randomly done in terms of DNA, and that's reflected in the fossil record. To the extent that there's sort of these jumps in the fossil record, and this is what you talk about in Darwin's Doubt, is that it's not a continuous process of mutation upon mutation building one on the other just randomly.
It becomes a big engineering problem because it's not just that there's gaps in the fossil record. You have to ask, well, how would the evolutionary process produce all the new information necessary to build these completely new body plans?
Mutations, like, for real. Also, like, so many of these creationists just kind of assume that you're starting from scratch. Like, you have to start with scratch and you just have to randomly put together like DNA letters or amino acids. You just have to randomly throw stuff together and then get a functional sequence at the end of it. And that's what they think that you're calculating the probabilities of, which is a complete and utter straw man. In reality, evolution works on what's already there. So you take one generation, replicate it, introduce a few mutations, and then see what you get. You don't start from scratch. This is not analogous to the process of evolution.
New cell types, new anatomical structures. And we know it would take a lot of new information. And so then you've got to look, well, is there enough time to do that?
Yes.
Do you have enough trials?
Yes.
Through this mechanism? And the answer is just overwhelmingly no, it's not.
Nope, that's just a complete lie. Again, the waiting time problem is solved with polymorphisms of proteins and DNA. Like, this completely solves the math. You don't get these big, huge numbers of billions of years just to get one functional sequence, like Meyer is lying through his teeth to try to tell you otherwise.
Plausible at all mathematically. And on the flip side, we do know, however, of a cause that is sufficient to produce new information. This is why it's not a god of the gaps or an argument from ignorance.
Well, yeah, like literally any physical process is capable of producing new information, or at least the vast majority of them. Like when two air molecules collide against each other, they generate new information about their, the kinetics of the exchange, the angles of the collision. There's a ton of new information generated every single time two air molecules hit each other. There's new information being generated constantly all around us by literally every physical interaction. So yeah, you don't need a mind for this.
Is we're drawing, and this is Darwin's historical scientific method. When you're trying to explain an event in the remote past, you want to draw on your knowledge of cause and effect. What kind of cause is out there that we've observed that is capable of producing the effect in question?
Literally every physical process.
And if the effect is a lot of new digital information, we know of a cause that can do that. And
yeah, like everything produces new information.
It's a mind or an intelligence. And it happens that's the...
This is just such a failure in reasoning. Like, this guy cannot think of literally any other process capable of generating information other than from minds. There's so many counterexamples, literally so many. The majority of all processes known are counterexamples.
Only known cause that can produce lots of new information. And it's certainly much more plausible than the Darwinian idea of a random search. And we show why mathematically it's much more plausible.
Now, one of the theories about the idea that randomness is still in the system is Stephen Jay Gould's idea of punctuated equilibrium, that essentially small groups of animals kind of went away from the big group. They did all their changes and then they reintegrated. Why doesn't that work? The idea that the jumps in the fossil record are a result of small groups breaking away in a certain level of group selection.
Yeah, Gould's
yeah, it does work.
model was a terrific advance.
To be clear, like Gould's model does not work. Gould's model is rejected, but the overall idea of just like groups splitting off from other groups and adapting to environmental changes and selection pressures, that does totally work, actually, Ben. Congratulations. That does work. It's real.
As far as its accuracy in describing the fossil record, because he described these big punctuations or big jumps, and then the long-term stasis that would occur, lack of directional evolutionary change. That's what we see in the fossil record.
But that's how evolution works, yeah. I mean, you're not going to have big evolutionary changes unless you have big environmental changes or big changes in the environment that can create new niches or something, some kind of change to generate it in the environment. Otherwise, you're just going to have stabilizing selection.
Very non-Darwinian. The problem was he didn't really have a mechanism that could accomplish that could produce the amount of change that we're seeing.
Good thing that we do now. It's called population genetics.
I discussed it as a whole I do a whole chapter on this in Darwin's Doubt, but the mechanism he proposed was called species selection. A lot of other evolutionary biologists, including Richard Dawkins, were very critical of the mechanism, and in a way rightly so, because what it came down to in the end was that species selection itself depended on the natural selection random mutation mechanism. And that mechanism requires lots of time to get the job done. And it turns out 4 billion years isn't enough, but certainly the abrupt jumps that Gould was talking about were not allowing the mechanism enough time to work. So you had this kind of irony in evolutionary biology in the 80s and 90s in particular. Gould's model pretty much was dismissed by the early 2000s.
Well, hey, at least he got something right there. Yes, it has been.
But you had Gould's model was viewed as a good one for describing the fossil record accurately, but it didn't have a mechanism. The Darwinians had a mechanism, but it was inconsistent with the fossil record.
Well, some of what Gould was saying was correct. It's just that his model was incorrect. Like the overall idea that you can have rapid, like relatively rapid changes in the fossil record is like true and borne out by the evidence and mechanistically plausible under what we understand of population genetics.
And also then, as we've later critiqued, the mechanism was also lacked the creative power to generate the information necessary to build big new, major innovations in history.
Well, he's just wrong about that. Mutation does have that power.
So from a design perspective, what exactly is the theory of how one species would become another suddenly? Is it there's a bunch of dead DNA that is suddenly activated? Or is it that...
Yeah.
What the... What was that question, Ben? Whoa. Where did that come from? So far, a lot of Ben's questions have been like pretty well researched. He'll be citing sources. I'm like, okay, Ben knows a little bit what he's talking about here. And then he just asked him, I'm sorry, what? Let's go back and listen to that question again.
Big new, major innovations in the history of life.
So from a design perspective, what exactly is the theory of how one species would become another suddenly?
From a design perspective, how does one species become another species suddenly? Okay, wait, so he's asking Stephen for a mechanism for intelligent design, for like theistic evolution. How does God or how does a mind change one species to another suddenly? Is that what he's asking?
Is that there's a bunch of dead DNA that is suddenly activated?
Is there a bunch of dead DNA that's suddenly activated? I'm sorry, what? Like, is this like a created heterozygosity kind of argument? Like, I think Ben is just mostly confused about what he's even asking here.
Or is it that something injects new information into the system? How exactly would that work?
So he is asking, what is the mechanism by which this mind actually accomplishes the intelligent guiding of this evolutionary change, which Stephen seemed to acknowledge is present in the fossil record. So this is actually a good question, like horribly phrased, really badly phrased, but I think the idea of what he's asking is actually a good one. What's your God mechanism, Stephen?
Well, the question of species raises this whole question of envelopes of variability. We see evidence of design at the loci of the design are when you get the major innovations occurring in the history of life. But the information that is present in a major group of organisms might be sufficient to allow a lot of variation within an envelope.
So wait a minute. So Stephen is saying, it sounds like he's saying there's microevolution within species, but when you need big changes, then you need God to come in or an intelligent designer to come in and actually like introduce that information to make that change, I guess.
That's why there is evolution. We think there's clearly evolution that takes place. The question is how much information was present and how wide the envelopes of variability are.
Okay, so he just said clearly evolution does take place. Okay, Stephen, thanks for acknowledging that. He's just saying that there's an envelope of variability. So, like, he's acknowledging that as time progresses and generation go to generation to next, you get more and more and more different from the previous generations. So he's saying that there's some sort of envelope of variability where there's some sort of borders where that variation is constrained by some sort of imaginary mechanism that I don't think Stephen's ever going to address.
That are generated by that information. So there's a terrific evolutionary biologist and cell biologist at the University of Chicago, also named Shapiro, James Shapiro, who's got a new theory of evolution he calls natural genetic engineering. And he notices
this smells like bullshit to me. Like, I'm pretty sure I've read about James Shapiro before, and I think that, like, I think he has an off-brand hypothesis for abiogenesis, but it's still like a naturalistic one. Like, I don't think that he's an intelligent design proponent. So I have a feeling that there's some quote mining here or some straw manning, but I don't know enough for sure about what he's specifically referencing.
Is that, and has documented that many of the mutations that we actually see at work are not random at all. They're an expression of what he calls pre-programmed adaptive capacity, where
okay, well, sure. To some degree, this is correct. Like, there are hot and cold spots in the genome that are more and less likely to experience mutations. There are, like, sometimes in response to stress, some organisms will actually induce mutations, like not specific ones, not targeted ones, but they'll go into like a highly mutagenic phase and start mutating a bunch because eventually they could get a mutation that could help them through that hard time. So to some degree, that's true. Like, sometimes organisms will sort of game mutations when they need them, but it's not like they're getting a specific mutation that they wanted just because it's pre-programmed to show up. They're still stochastic.
There's an external trigger or stress put on an organism, and that triggers the production of certain proteins that for which the organism had the capability of building all along because it had the genetic information there. And so a lot of the evolution we see is actually
wait a minute. What did he just say? It sounded like he just confused himself right there. He said, like, in response to certain stresses, okay, there will be triggers that will like cause the cell to start generating proteins in response to that stress. Like, yes, so far none of that had anything to do with directed mutagenesis. So I think that he's confused himself about what he's even talking about here. Like, so far he's just described like the basic central dogma of biochemistry. You have some sort of trigger that generates the cell to make some proteins. Like, yeah. Okay, good one, Stephen.
Programmed adaptive capacity, which is really an exciting biological phenomenon that the Darwinians haven't really taken full account of, but it does raise the question of the origin of that adaptive capacity. Where did the pre-programming come from?
Again, it comes from mutation, selection, and drift, like the same mechanisms of population change over time in population genetics and evolution. Like, you could still evolve a stress response in which you induce mutagenesis. Like, such a process is completely evolvable. There's no reason why it's not. I mean, come on.
So intelligent design says the inputs of information from outside the system, from an intelligence, are located in that pre-programmed adaptive capacity. But the theory also acknowledges that there is evolution possible going downstream as a result of that pre-existing information.
Oh, so you want to have your cake and eat it too. I got you. So you can evolve and you can have all these kinds of changes and evolve over time, and that's reflected in the fossil record. But if you want to change too much towards some arbitrary limit that Stephen Myers and the creationists say is that's too much change. Now that's macro evolution, and that's impossible because there's some sort of arbitrary threshold that they've established. I see. Well, I want somebody to demonstrate that such a threshold exists in reality. And I also would like Tanya to stop bringing this up because I don't think that she's bringing it up in good faith, and I don't think she's accurately representing my actual position, and it sounds like a straw man every time she brings it up in bad faith. So I'd appreciate if she would accurately represent me.
All right, so let's talk about the origin of life problem. The question being, how did organic life arise from non-organic material. There are some experiments that were done in the early 20th century in which...
Okay, so we just disproved evolution. Now let's disprove abiogenesis. Perfect.
Under certain conditions, it looked as though maybe organic material could be created from non-organic material, but there really, as you point out, has not been a great explanation of how non-organic material could create an information system like DNA. I was wondering if you could elucidate that.
So yeah, the famous experiment still in a lot of the biology textbooks is the Miller-Urey experiment of 1952, 1953. They sparked a chamber that had gases known as reducing gases that then spontaneously produced a few of the 20 protein-forming amino acids, 2 or 3. Problem is that amino acids do not a protein make, and proteins by themselves do not make life. So they were really quite a long ways away from demonstrating anything like a spontaneous chemical origin of life. It's ironic that that experiment was performed in...
Well, yeah, they were just demonstrating this naturalistic, spontaneous generation of the building blocks of life.
The same year as Watson and Crick's discovery of the structure of the DNA molecule and the subsequent elucidation of the information-bearing properties of the molecule. Because in what's called chemical evolutionary theory, by the 1960s and certainly by the early 1980s, the field reached a state of impasse precisely because the biologists and the biochemists realized that to build an actual living cell, you've got to have information-rich molecules. You can't just have the components, you can't just have the letters, you've got to have the sentences. And so there were a number of problems with the Miller-Urey experiment. One was they presupposed conditions on the early Earth and in the early Earth's atmosphere that didn't actually match the conditions on the early Earth. We didn't have a reducing atmosphere. We had a slightly oxidizing or neutral atmosphere. You rerun those experiments, you don't get amino acids.
Oh, well, that's just completely bullshit. Okay, no, we did not have an oxidizing atmosphere. Like in prebiotic, I don't know what he is talking about right there, but I'm not aware of any experiment showing that we had an oxidizing atmosphere in the prebiotic Earth. Maybe it's not as strongly reducing as was thought in the 50s back in the Miller-Urey experiment, but like I think the consensus is that it's somewhere between like reducing and neutral. It could be weakly reducing, more weakly reducing than thought in the 50s, but it's definitely not oxidizing. I don't know anybody that's said anything like that. Maybe I'm wrong. If anybody has any citations that the prebiotic Earth there's evidence that it was oxidizing atmosphere, then let me know, because that would shock me. For those of you that maybe aren't following, let me see if I can maybe explain what reducing and oxidizing atmospheres are. This is kind of in reference to what's going to happen to you if you're in these atmospheres. Are you going to be getting electrons stripped off of your atoms, or are you going to be getting electrons donated and electrons like put onto your atoms? So in a reducing atmosphere, you're actually getting electrons imparted onto you whenever you're in the atmosphere. Like electrons are just being added onto the atoms in your body. And I know it's weird that it's called reducing, but it's because it's like it reduces the charge because electrons are negatively charged. So adding more electrons onto your body is actually like reducing the charge. So a reducing atmosphere is just going to be coating you with electrons when you're outside in it. And an oxidizing atmosphere does the opposite. It strips you of electrons when you're out in it. So this is like our current atmosphere is an oxidizing atmosphere. It contains a lot of oxygen, and oxygen is one of the most like electron greedy atoms there is. Like oxygen is just going to be stripping electrons off of like everything that's around it, basically, because it only needs 2 electrons in order to get a complete set. So it's going to be doing everything it can to just gobble up 2 nearby electrons so that it can complete its set and be stable and happy. So when oxygen is in the atmosphere, it's going to be very oxidizing, obviously. It's going to be stripping electrons off of everything. That's actually the reason why we need to breathe oxygen, because our metabolisms basically are taking the really like high energy electrons in our food and stripping them off of the food, and then ultimately putting them onto the oxygen that we breathe and harvesting the energy from taking those high energy electrons from food, and then taking the energy out of them and then just shoving them off onto oxygen when they're too low energy and you can't take energy out of them anymore. You've gotten everything that you could get from your food. You put those electrons onto the oxygen, and then you're done with it. You breathe out carbon dioxide, and the hydrogen gets added onto the oxygen, becomes water, and you pee it out. So that's why you breathe in oxygen. That was kind of a huge tangent. I'm sorry for that, but hopefully some of you guys maybe learn something new about what an oxidizing versus a reducing atmosphere is. Anyways, what Stephen Meyer just said about the prebiotic atmosphere actually not being reducing and being oxidizing was completely wrong.
Forming spontaneously. But the bigger problem was, how do you arrange the amino acids in the very specific ways that are required to form a three-dimensional structure called a protein fold?
Okay, so you don't actually need a very specific sequence to form just like generally functional enzymes, functional proteins. He's kind of making the faulty assumption that you need one specific sequence to do one specific function that you need. And if you don't have that one specific sequence, then you can no longer do that function and you just get nothing. You get nowhere. And that's just not a correct assumption to make, because there are several very, very simple, amino acid aggregations like proteins, polypeptides, amyloids, which can have enzymatic functional activity and are like incredibly sequence robust. Like a huge number of different sequences are able to accomplish this enzymatic functional activity. So you don't need a specific sequence. Any old sequence will do. You don't need a specific one for certain functions. And that's what Stephen Meyer is either willfully ignorant of or lying about.
And that problem hasn't been solved apart from watching DNA do it inside living cells. So to build...
No, I mean, like I just went over the solution to this supposed problem that he's pointing out. Once again, the solution is the polymorphism, the same solution to the last problem that Stephen Meyer thought that he had with evolution.
Proteins, what we know is you need information stored in the DNA molecule. And so as the molecular...
Again, no, you don't. In order to get functional proteins, you actually don't need any information stored in any DNA molecule at all. And I've shown amyloid studies on this channel, which have taken random sequences of amino acids and made amyloids out of them, which can be functional, enzymatically functional. They can have functions and be functional protein enzymes without having any information or relationship to DNA at all. No starting information. So, or at least no starting information that was coming from a mind. The starting information was just passively present in the background noise of the environment. Like, is the example of where information comes from for mutations or for abiogenesis or any of these processes. It's passively just background noise in the environment. The environment is so rich with background noise of information all the time that selection can take that information, select it, and then use it to create a functional sequence. It's not controversial. We understand how this works.
Our biological revolution unfolded in the 50s, 60s, 70s. People, the scientists working on the origin of life realized the problem was much harder than they realized, because they didn't just need to account for certain kinds of building blocks of life. They needed to account for the information that would organize the building blocks into DNA molecules, into protein molecules, and into the complex information processing systems that characterize even the simplest living cells.
And that's exactly what selection, natural selection, describes. So that's fully in line with how we know natural selection works. In order to have Darwinian evolution, all you really need is like a self-replicating system, a self-replicating chemical system where you have differential reproductive rates depending on the stability of your molecule. Amyloids check off these necessary properties. Ribozymes check off these characteristics. Like, there are numerous types of autocatalytic chemical sets which have these properties and are capable of undergoing natural selection. So that explains exactly where you get this information coming from. The information is in the background of the environment and is then selected for on these self-replicating systems, which then is a natural filtering of like actually getting a sequence of functional information over generations. Like, this process that Stephen is talking about is well characterized.
One of the theories that has been posited to sort of solve this problem is the so-called RNA world thesis. Can you talk about what exactly that is?
So one of the reasons the origin of life problem is so hard for evolutionary biologists is you can't invoke natural selection reasonably.
Yes, you can. I just did reasonably.
Because natural selection only depends on self-replication.
Yes, and self-replication can spontaneously arise in autocatalytic chemical systems, as has been demonstrated multiple times in multiple chemical systems, even inorganic ones based on molybdenum.
Differential survival of lots of offspring. Okay.
Exactly. Stephen Myers actually just did a great job. You need the differential survival of lots of offspring that have some inheritable information from their parental generations. And that's about it. If you have that, then you have natural selection. And you can have that with multiple different chemical systems that all predate DNA and life.
Okay, but that only happens, differential organisms only divide and reproduce on the basis of things that are happening at a molecular level that involve information-rich DNA and proteins.
No, they don't. And I just gave several examples showing that that is not the case, including inorganic ones with molybdenum that have nothing at all to do with DNA or proteins.
So if you're trying to explain the origin of information-rich DNA and proteins, you can't invoke prebiotic natural selection.
Yes, you can. You absolutely can. It's been demonstrated in laboratories. There's no reason why you could not. Literally all of the necessary principles to have Darwinistic natural selection are present in autocatalytic chemical systems.
It's a contradiction in terms, as one of the great evolutionary biologists, Debunking, said. So that made the origin of life problem even harder than the problems we've been talking about previously.
Wow, Stephen Myers must be really tired after a long day in the quote mine.
As far as explaining the origin of the information for new forms of life. But one theory that attempted to get around that is called the RNA world. And it was based on the observation that some RNA molecules can perform two functions at once. They can perform the function of information storage, like DNA, but they can also catalyze certain reactions, like proteins. Proteins catalyze at much faster rates than would otherwise occur, really crucial biochemical reactions that are crucial in metabolism.
True.
So if RNA could do both, the thought was, then maybe life started with an RNA molecule that could copy itself, that could get natural selection going at a molecular level before you had life.
And that was also a confirmed prediction of the RNA world hypothesis, that RNA should be able to do both of those functions. And then we found ribozymes that did.
Problem has turned out, again, to be an information problem. So we've done experiments on RNA. It's turned out that they call them ribozyme engineering experiments. And the name is apt because it is a lot of intelligent design. It's a lot of engineering. But people have tried to engineer RNA molecules by arranging the sequence of bases. RNA, like DNA, has these bases that carry information. And they've arranged the bases very specifically to try to build RNA molecules that would copy themselves to get a self-replicating system going, which would get natural selection going. Problem is, number one, we have been able to design some RNA molecules that will copy about 10% of themselves, but only if the bases are very specifically arranged, which means that to get a self-replicating system going, you got to have information. And where is the information coming from? It's coming from the intelligent biochemist who's doing the ribozyme engineering.
Except that we've done similar experiments with amyloids with absolutely no previous sequence determined by the design of the experiment. Like the experimenters are not using their minds to input any kind of sequence information to start this. You get a randomly generated sequence of amyloids, which then has the self-reproducing capacity, the catalytic functions, and everything. Like amyloids are incredibly diverse in the amount of functions that they're able to do and the characteristics these molecules have. And they're just one example of the type of chemical systems which can have properties of this. There are literally multiple different examples of these chemical systems, not just amyloids, not just ribozymes, not just molybdenum circuitry, not just iron sulfur complexes. Like there's tons of different chemical systems that can be the basis for self-replicating Darwinian natural selection and evolution.
So what's actually being simulated in these simulations is the need, we argue, for intelligent design. The RNA world doesn't eliminate or doesn't refute the intelligent design argument based on information. It actually demonstrates or illustrates the need for intelligent design. And so I don't think it really solves the problem unless RNA world people are saying, well, that's where the intelligent designer input the information in the first place.
Okay, so it seems like the biggest blowback that you've gotten, obviously, in terms of intelligent design is the term intelligent design, because it seems like most of the critiques that you've made of Neo-Darwinism are fairly well accepted. Is that accurate?
Increasingly so. In 2006.
Oh, God, Ben, no, please, I beg you, have an actual evolutionary biologist on your program, not this guy. He's not even like a scientist, man. He worked for a gas station company, and then he worked for the Discovery Institute, man. This guy is not a scientist. He has no degree in like science other than an undergrad.
2016, a number of us attended a conference at the Royal Society of London in obviously London, and it was a group of leading evolutionary biologists called the meeting to address new trends in evolutionary biology. They called it was an innocuous way of saying Neo-Darwinism is dead and we need a new theory.
Oh my God, no, it wasn't, Stephen. That's you do not speak for the group, my friend.
First talk at the conference was by a leading Austrian evolutionary biologist named Gerd Muller, who enumerated 5 what he called explanatory deficits of Neo-Darwinism. Elsewhere, he's written that Neo-Darwinism,
again, Neo-Darwinism has not been the consensus since the 70s, my guy.
has no theory of the generative, by which he means it explains the small-scale variations very well, like the Galapagos finches, but it doesn't explain the origin of major innovations in the history of life.
Yeah, mutation, boom, explained.
And so many evolutionary biologists are now, there's an aphorism that's afoot. It's mutation and selection explain the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest. The problem is the main mechanism of evolutionary change doesn't seem to have significant creative power. And that's the problem, I think, increasingly being recognized. And as a result of that, many people within evolutionary biology are looking for new mechanisms, calling for the formulation of a new theory. And that's kind of striking. It's an astounding admission when you think about.
Except that's not what they're doing, man. They're not overthrowing any of the equations of population genetics or how evolution works. They're not looking for a different theory of evolution. That none of that is true. Like it's just a new historical phase in science where we continue to learn about things we didn't know before. That's how literally this whole thing works. So, like, come on. We can have different phases. We had the Neo-Darwinist phase. We had the modern synthesis phase. These are historical phases of science. We moved past them. We learned things we didn't know before, and now we know more. And evolution theory is all the more richer for it. It's not like it's been debunked or replaced, or we're needing a new theory or any of this guy's spins on any of these events.
About how the theory is presented through the textbooks, with science popularizers, the new atheists, the public spokesman for science, the National Center for Science Education, the National Academy of Sciences. When they talk about evolution, it's a fact. Richard Dawkins has said that if you find someone who questions it, they're either stupid, wicked, or insane. But the reality on the ground, or rather in the peer-reviewed literature within evolutionary biology, is very different. There's a recognition that the fundamental problems haven't been solved, and one of which is Muller acknowledged the problem of the origin of biological form. When I saw that, it's in a table in a book that he's written with another evolution.
And what does that even mean? The origin of biological form? Like, man, I wish I could ask Muller myself what he means by that, because like, what does that mean? Can anybody tell me the origin of biological form? If anybody knows, yeah, please let me know.
Evolutionary biologists is a list of unsolved problems, one of which they list the origin of biological form. I was stunned. That's 2003, MIT Press. That was the very problem that Darwin was supposed to have solved in 1859, and it's now an open question.
Well, with that said,
yeah, I really think that that's not what they meant, Stephen. I really think that what the evolutionary biologists are talking about. I don't know much about Gerd Muller. I need to look more up about them, but it kind of seems like he might be getting quote mined here yet again from Stephen, that saying that, and if Gerd Muller is actually saying that it is currently an open issue in the field of something that like Darwin solved back in the 19th century, I would be shocked. I could be wrong on this. If you guys know about Gerd Muller, maybe he's a creationist. I don't know, but I would be shocked if Stephen Meyer is portraying this accurately.
It seems like for a lot of folks like Dawkins, it's not about the God of the gaps, it's about the Darwinism of the gaps. The idea that eventually we're going to figure out that Darwinism still holds in these circumstances where it appears not to hold.
What circumstances where it appears not to hold?
Is that accurate, or does he have a theory for how to fix it?
Well, there's a very good explanation for that in the sociology and philosophy of science.
Like, is he just talking about stuff like sexual selection or like anything that's not natural selection? Like, yeah, we know about those, Ben.
The assumption is we have to have a materialistic explanation. We can't.
That's what science is. Science is methodologically naturalist. That's like literally what has given us such an irrefutable track record of success in science, is by following methodological naturalism.
Allow creative intelligence or agency or mind to.
No. Creative intelligence, agency, and mind are all non-supernatural. That's all methodologically natural. I hate to tell you, Stephen, but none of that stuff that you just listed is supernatural. That's all still within naturalism.
We can't posit that as part of the explanation for how life got here. And there's a rule that
no, you can't. You can have a completely methodologically natural hypothesis for how life got here that has nothing to do with any supernatural minds. You can have purely physical minds.
Many scientists take as normative. It's called methodological naturalism. And it says if you're going to be a scientist, you have to explain everything by reference to purely undirected material processes. And if you deviate from that in any way, you're not being scientific. That's why.
Okay, yeah, at least we agree on that much.
I got called a pseudoscientist.
Oh, we agree on that too, Stephen. We agree on a lot, actually.
On the Wikipedia webpage. It was a little bit of an upgrade because previously they had me down as a theologian, and I have no training in theology. But in any case,
wait, wait, did he just say that being a pseudoscientist is an upgrade from being a theologian? Like, did we really just catch him admitting that? Like, I don't think he meant to say that way or imply that, but like, wow, like the fact that he just said a pseudoscientist is like an upgrade, a better designation than being a theologian. Tell us how you really think about religion, Stephen.
case, this methodological rule is actually only as recent as the late 19th century in science. The founders of modern science, Newton, Boyle, Kepler, they didn't adhere to this at all. They saw design in science.
Dude, they also believed in like alchemy, my guy. like the guys that were like in the 1600s. Like, maybe we should not be taking our philosophy of science from like people that lived before the Industrial Revolution.
In the natural world, and they wrote about it in their science in their science treaties. For example, in the General Scholium to the Principia, Newton's great work on gravitation, he's got a terrific argument for design based on the fine-tuning of the planetary orbits.
Oh, and he had a terrific argument for the Philosopher's Stone too. That doesn't mean that every single thing that Isaac Newton ever said or every argument that he made was sound and reasonable. Like, these guys are not infallible.
So design arguments were part of science from its foundation, but they became verboten in the late 19th century after the origin of species. And
wow, it's almost as if like we actually learned about how a lot of the things that people previously attributed to supernatural agency actually naturalistically arose, and we discovered that through the scientific process. Wow, fascinating how that works. It must be some massive conspiracy to try to get rid of your God.
And there's a very curious thing about this rule of methodological naturalism. If you're investigating an origin question or a causal origins question, it's a rule that actually limits the intellectual freedom of the scientist. There's a lot of areas of science where methodological naturalism is innocuous. But if you're asking the question, what caused life or the information necessary to produce life to arise? And you recognize that it could be an undirected material process, or it might have been a mind, but then you decide in advance that you're not going to consider any evidence of mind. Of course, you're only going to get materialistic explanations.
Well, again, mind is not a supernatural explanation, okay? There's nothing supernatural about minds, okay?
But the explanations may not be adequate. I mean, imagine you go into the British Museum, you look at the Rosetta Stone, you see all those inscriptions in 3 different languages, and you say, well, I'd like to say it was a scribe, but since I adhere to methodological naturalism, I've got to say it was wind and erosion or something like that.
Scribes are not supernatural either. Like, what are you talking about, dude? We use methodological naturalism, like we use naturalistic assumptions in history all the time. People writing things is not supernatural. This analogy is completely broken.
The rule actually limits scientists from following the evidence where it most naturally leads.
Except it doesn't naturally lead towards a supernatural mind, Stephen.
Information based on our knowledge of cause and effect is a strong indicator of the activity of intelligence, and yet we can't say that or consider that if we accept methodological naturalism. And
But you can't say that because it doesn't logically follow.
that's what's going on. That's why the dialectic kind of goes in circles, where you'll get a new evolutionary model every few years, and then they circle back to the one that was rejected 20 years ago and start the cycle all over again.
But that's not happening. That pattern is just purely in your head.
Because we're really looking in the wrong place. We're barking up the wrong tree.
I mean, it does raise the question, if you're a methodological natural.
Like, what did we go back to? Like, what is he saying? Like, okay, after the modern synthesis, after Neo-Darwinism, after we figured out about epigenetics and all the other stuff that Darwin couldn't possibly have known, at what point did we go back to the previous paradigm? Remind me again when that happened, because I cannot seem to recall.
And all you believe is that undirected processes are responsible for everything. Why you believe in such a thing as objective truth, for example, because
or the reliability.
What are you serious? Why do you believe in objective truth if you believe that everything is naturalistic? Because you can do like intersubjective experiments. Are you serious? Like, it's very reliable.
The human mind, as we were discussing before the interview.
right? I mean,
You can how do you accept the reliability of the human mind? Just go outside. Have you been outside? Have you interacted with the world around you? You can do so fairly reliably. I mean, come on. Are you serious? They're trying to like get us to slip into solipsism now just because they can't have their little presuppositions.
If the idea is that the human mind is capable of grasping the world around it, and there is such a thing as objective truth that we can grasp, then that would suggest that our mind reflects the universe in some deep, profound way.
Or it's just functionally advantageous to have a mind that can interact reliably with the world around it. No? Like, why would it not? Why would you not evolve to have sensory systems that can accurately detect the world around you and you can interact with it in a way that you can reliably increase your reproductive success? Like, that would seem to create a mind that would favor one that could accurately perceive the world around it, because it would be functionally beneficial to do so.
As opposed to the sort of evolutionary biology belief, which is that we are just adaptable balls of meat. And so whatever we think about the universe, maybe it's helpful in terms of our adaptation, but it's not necessarily true.
Well, how would it be advantageous if it was not true? Ben, I don't understand that at all. Like, can somebody please explain that one to me? Because if life is adapted for the world around us, then shouldn't we be able to perceive what's truly around us? If that would be advantageous, would it not? I mean, if we were perceiving things that aren't even there, how would that be evolutionary advantageous?
Very well put. This was the very thing that bothered Thomas Nagel, the great philosopher of science from NYU. Nagel got himself into a bit of trouble. He wrote a favorable review of Signature in the Cell in the Times Literary Supplement. And then there was a huge blowback, including from a lot of other fellow atheists. Nagel's an atheist. But Nagel accepted the critical arguments in Signature in the Cell and began to get more critical of Darwinism as well, not just chemical evolutionary theory, but biological evolutionary theory. And in 2012, he doubled down by publishing his own book with Oxford Press called Mind and Cosmos, How the Neo-Darwinian Materialist View of Reality is Almost Certainly False, was the subtitle. And his problem was the one that you just articulated, that clearly we live in a universe in which mind is a reality. And if Neo-Darwinism can't account for that, then it's missing something really big.
Well, why wouldn't it be able to account for that? I mean, having a mind is clearly an advantage for an organism over not having a mind. So seems like it would be accounted for within an evolutionary understanding.
It's an inadequate explanation for something we observe all the time, which is the activity of minds. I see it in our conversation. I know I have a mind by my own introspective experience. This is a part of reality too.
And minds evolved. I hate to break it to you, Stephen, but your mind evolved.
If evolution can't account for that, and
which it can, I mean, we understand the evolution of the nervous system. I mean, we have plenty of information about it.
We exclude mind as an explanatory principle, we're going to have an impoverished understanding of the world around us.
Wait, he's saying that if we exclude mind as an explanatory principle for the origins of mind, it kind of seems a little circular now, Stephen. You're veering into circular reasoning.
And so I think this is a very important aspect of the debate is recognizing that mind is a reality.
Well, this actually is one of the fascinating sort of theories that Dawkins puts forth, is essentially that mind is a spandrel, that mind is just something that we feel like we have, but it actually does not exist in the first place, which does raise the question as to why he does what he does for a living. I mean, if you're in the business of explanation, why bother operating along the spandrels?
It's extremely self-defeating. You're absolutely right. But it's interesting that the Neo-Darwinists say that design in life is an illusion. We have apparent design, but not real design. It's first line from the Blind Watchmaker, page 1. Biology.
I want to just highlight this comment from Titan here, that brains evolves and minds are an emergent property of brains. Yeah, I'm not sure if I necessarily would agree with that, Titan. I would say that both brains and minds evolved, and that minds are an activity that a brain does. So I don't know. Maybe I'm totally off base. Maybe you guys disagree with me on that one, but that's my own take there. So.
Is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. But
yeah, I broadly agree actually with what Stephen has been saying, that you can have stuff that might look designed, but really it only looks that way because it's passed through round after round after round of natural selection.
At the end of the day, Dawkins also has to say that mind itself, purposive intelligence, is also an illusion. That's an impoverished worldview. We all know better than that.
I don't know about that, Stephen. I don't know about that. I definitely think that there are a lot of pretty enlightened Buddhists that might have some Buddhist monks out there that would have just such a worldview and would say, oh, yes, mind is an illusion, the self is an illusion. And I think it's kind of insulting to the Buddhist world to call their worldview impoverished. No, I mean, I think that you can have a pretty rich, fulfilled, and wise worldview with the idea that the mind and the self are illusory, and indeed one that actually tracks with our modern understanding of like molecular neurobiology or physics.
And does raise questions, I mean, far beyond that for civilization as well, since we all have to live together and reason together. I've had this exact argument with Sam Harris, who says he believes in objective truth and reason. And I keep saying to him, well, we're wandering balls of meat with no purpose in the universe. So what is this reason you're talking about? We're a bunch of firing neurons over which we have no control.
Also, Titan, we are kind of doing abiogenesis as well. It's not just evolution. I mean, here in the video, they've been talking about evolution, abiogenesis, the Big Bang. I mean, they literally are talking about all of it. So I don't mind.
Yeah, two points on that. And I think you've addressed them both. I think you're addressing the point you just made in your new book. But our whole legal system is based on notions of moral responsibility, culpability before the law. That presupposes our ability to choose as free agents, that we're not completely determined by undirected, firings in our synapse. It was not just nature or nurture. There's human free will and moral responsibility.
Well, firing in your synapses is directed, but okay, yeah, no, I do. I mean, now he's just talking about determinism, free will, and all that stuff, which I've unpacked on the channel before. I'm not going to get all into here, but you guys know I'm a determinist. So
our whole legal system is based on that idea.
And you could still have like a much better legal system, in fact, that's based on one of like just pragmatically solving moral issues, correcting problems, rehabilitating people for better outcomes. Like when you get rid of this sense of retributive, like Iron Age sense of this like theological moral framework of punishment, and you can actually get towards a legal and moral system and more accurate, scientifically accurate view of psychology, how the brain works, in a way that actually you get a lot better results. Rehabilitative justice is much better than Stephen Meyer's ideal legal system.
And secondly, we have this epidemic of teen suicide in our country. And I heard something you did on your show a little while ago, and I had a very similar experience of kind of existential anxiety as a young person. It was a fairly middle-class upbringing, had no great deprivation, but I had this recurring question: what's it going to matter in 100 years? What will any human achievement ever matter? And this question of the purpose of human existence, I think, is gnawing at a lot of people in our culture, especially young people, because only personal agents can confer meaning on something. Nothing can mean something to a rock or to an atom, and we find meaning in reality.
Well, whoa, he's kind of dipping into some very existentialist lines of thinking now. I mean, he's kind of gone from the traditional Christian viewpoint now to saying like, well, meaning is generated by conscious entities. You can't have basically just going into existentialist lines of thought now. I'm kind of shocked. Oh, wait. Yeah.
Relationship to other persons. And if at the end of the day, we're just going to have this heat death of the universe, and there's no mind behind the universe, no personal agency behind the universe.
Yep.
There's no possibility of ultimate meaning. And a lot of people sense that.
Sure. Yep. That's true.
It's very deeply troubling. And we're really not answering that question for a lot of young people.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of hard questions that people have to grapple with, difficult truths out there. Like, sorry if you don't like the truth and you can't handle the truth out there, but and you're bummed out by it, but it's not really the universe's job to conform with how you want the universe to be. I mean, we kind of are in the one we're in.
I think one of the philosophical implications of intelligent design, which doesn't attempt to prove the existence of God, but it does imply that personal agency is fundamental to the cosmos, and it opens up the possibility that there could be a good answer to that question of.
Oh, it makes Stephen feel good, guys. Come on. Don't take Stephen's nice theory away from him. It answers Stephen's questions. It makes him feel important, guys. Come on. Stop debunking intelligent design. Look at who, okay, guys, when you are debunking intelligent design, this is who you're being mean to. This is the face of the guy that you're making very sad with your reasoned and empirical argument, guys. Stop it. You're making Stephen sad.
Of meaning and purpose that I think is gnawing at a lot of people.
So let's talk about how intelligent design should be taught in schools. So as we've mentioned, a lot of...
how it should be taught in schools. God dang, Ben.
Scientists basically accept the generalized critiques of Neo-Darwinism that you've expressed in your books. Is there
what? Okay, yeah. Assuming that the scientists generally all accept what Stephen Meyer is saying, and he wins his Nobel Prize and totally overturns the scientific consensus, what then, Stephen?
reason why we don't just say, we don't know? In other words, why don't we try and just teach it this way? Here's the theory of Neo-Darwinism. Here are all the flaws in the theory of Neo-Darwinism. It would be very difficult for folks to try and kick that out of school since you're not mentioning God.
Right.
You're not mentioning any intelligent designer at all. Why not teach it that way? And then you're firmly within even the skeptic's view of what science ought to be.
That happens to be our science education policy at the Discovery Institute. We propose that students are allowed to learn about the strengths and the weaknesses of different scientific theories, including Darwinian evolution. But there are many. A lot of people have a stereotyped view of science, which is really inaccurate. it's the men in white coats, and it's just about the facts, and there's no role for interpretation or debate or argument.
Okay, I'm kind of bored with how he wants to teach intelligent design, because this is kind of just like a LARP and like a fantasy of this guy. Like, none of this is ever gonna happen unless the U.S. slips into like a Christian nationalist theocratic dictatorship. None of that will come to true. Oh, yeah, fingers crossed. We can't say for certain, but if reasonable people are in charge of the country, okay, guys, this is making me depressing the way that I'm saying this right now, but it does not seem likely that these people will get their way. Okay, even without reasonable people in charge of the country, just with their current regime of power in charge, it doesn't seem like this guy's going to get his way and intelligent design is ever going to be taught in school. So like, what's even the point of like going into his little LARPing fantasy about how he would enact his grand design? Oh, nice. I Killed Earl coming in with the 5 memberships. Thank you so much, I Killed Earl, for blessing the chat here with your memberships. I want to call out here Yurtika Pidhajnik. God, you guys are making this hard to pronounce some of your names. Red Olympus, S, and Coffee Breath. They are all now certified based and can now spam the based emojis or the face palming Jesus in chat, which I love seeing. So good, big ups on I'd Killed Earl for that one. We're going to skip ahead here towards the end to get to their fine-tuning argument. And let's just close it out with fine
origin.
Now, is there an easy way out for folks when it comes to the fine-tuning argument or to the information argument by simply saying that there is no such actual distinction between meaningful information and Shannon information? There's no such distinction between fine-tuning and non-fine-tuning, except that we're here to see it. In other words, if the only thing that distinguishes an information-rich segment of text from a non-information-rich segment of text is the fact that we speak English. So if there's a bunch of letters and we can read them, then we think that they're meaningful. If there's a bunch of letters and we can't read them, we think that they're not meaningful. So in other words, are we reverse projecting mind onto a universe simply because we're here to
well, no,
it?
Because we do objectively recognize meaning and function. There is a possibility of false negative judgments. We might see a string of characters and not know the symbol convention, and therefore conclude that that string is just random or complex without being specified. But when we make a qualitative judgment of specificity of arrangement, when we see that the arrangement of characters is necessary to perform an independently observable function, that's a kind of information that is real and is something that we know is only associated with the causal activity of intelligent agents. So no biologist really, when you get down to it, wants to say,
no, it's not. You can have all sorts of functional information that's required to accomplish a function that has nothing to do with a mind at all. Like, you could have like information about the surrounding pH where it can only function like a certain biochemical process can only function at a certain pH. There's information right there. It's functional information. You need to have that certain pH. I mean, there's tons of different examples of functional information that has nothing to do with its design. There's like way more counterexamples than examples with minds.
Well, the sequence of characters in the DNA, the A, C's, and G's in the DNA molecule, the arrangement doesn't matter for building proteins, because all we have to do is change the arrangement and see that the protein unfolds and doesn't catalyze a reaction. There's a real objective way of recognizing function in biology, just as there is in human language. So,
okay, if you change the reactants, then you change the products of a chemical process. Just like just like his example that he just used here, that if you change the genes, then you change the overall protein. And so that proves that that was functional information. Well, guess what? There's functional information then in the structure of chemical reactants, because if you change those reactants, you get different products in your chemical reaction. So there you go. There's another example of functional information in chemical reactions that has nothing to do with minds.
So I think this qualitative in the information sciences, there's a distinction between specified or functional information on the one hand and mere complexity or randomness or Shannon information on the other.
Okay.
And that's a real distinction, and it underwrites the whole case for intelligent design. You're right.
Okay, so the countervailing case for a lot of this stuff is the theory of multiple universes.
I was hoping you would ask about that. Yeah,
people essentially saying that we are a bubble universe that is on a bunch of other bubbles, and that there are an infinite number of universes. So all of the probabilistic arguments that you make in favor of the chain of life and the creation of life, none of this matters in the end because there are a bajillion universes.
Right. And we just happen to be the lucky ones.
Exactly.
And they call it the observer selection effect. We think we're special because all the conditions that are necessary for our existence are so incredibly improbable. But in fact, some universe somewhere had to arise that produced organisms such as ourselves, conscious, aware, conscious and intelligent agents indeed. But there's a problem with this whole approach. And
well, actually, at least he did a decent job summarizing that. Like, I would not say that what he just said was like a complete straw man or anything. So at least so far, this is a better side of Stephen that we're getting so far. He hasn't done a single quote mine yet this section, and he hasn't done a straw man. We'll see what he's about to say, though.
Many problems, in fact, and you might imagine in this new book that I'm doing, I'm writing quite a lot about the multiverse and critique of it. But let me give you the most important problem, and that is that multiverse itself requires prior fine-tuning. The multiverse hypothesis presupposes prior fine-tuning. Here's the problem. If you have
Does it, though, Stephen? I'm going to need an example.
all these different universes out there, a gabillion of them. If the universes aren't in some way connected, then what happens in one universe has no material effect on events in another universe.
Sure, but they could be connected or they could not be connected. I mean, who knows? This is very much speculative.
So the fact that there may be a gabillion other universes out there, if they're disconnected, doesn't change anything in our universe, including the probabilities of our being here. So to solve that problem, and in recognition of that problem, proponents of the multiverse have proposed a common cause for all the universes, so that they can portray the multiverse, all these different universes, as the result of something like a big cosmic lottery, where there's some mechanism that's churning out universes where eventually one of them would have to have the right combination of factors to make life possible.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can see what he's saying. I mean, it's sort of starting to border on straw man at this point, but yeah, if there's just like an infinite number of universes being generated with different properties, then yeah, like any combination, any potential universe would then exist, no matter how improbable like that certain arrangement of properties would be. So sure, like he's being, you know, I guess he's conveying it accurately in that regard, but there's also different conceptions of the multiverse where the universes do have something to do with each other, and there's mother universes and daughter universes that sort of have like a Darwinian evolution of universes. So there's different theoretical constructions than what he's brought up so far.
Now, the problem, though, is that in all the universe generating mechanisms that have been proposed, there is prior fine-tuning. There's something called inflationary cosmology, and another, and there's something called the string theoretic landscape. So there's a string theory version of the multiverse, and there's an inflationary cosmology version. And in both cases, there has to be exquisite fine-tuning for the universe-generating mechanism to actually produce multiple universes. So the problem of the origin of the...
Like he's like literally speaking about a hypothetical universe-generating mechanism that like we literally have no idea what is possible for. Like he's saying, like we have two current extremely hypothetical models that could potentially describe a multiverse like that. And like he's pretending like there wouldn't be other possibilities, or that those current hypothetical possibilities that he's talking about are like complete and we know everything about them. That's the only way that he could be making such strong conclusions like he's making from his two examples.
Fine-tuning has just been pushed back one generation. One of my philosopher of physics colleagues, Robin Collins, uses an illustration like this. He says, so imagine you have some chef presents a beautiful loaf of bread to you, and you say, oh, chef, I'd like to compliment your skill as a chef, but I know you didn't actually design the recipe. It was a bread-making machine. There was no design in this. There was just a bread-making machine that produced the bread. But even if that were the case, the bread-making machine required prior design, as did the recipe for the dough that was put in it. So this is kind of analogous to what's going on with the multiverse. It only...
Unless, right, unless the way that these universes are generated doesn't require a universe generating machine, and it just requires an, you know, potentially infinite regress of universes with like daughter universes, mother universes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like there are tons of different models for a multiverse that don't suffer from any of the issues that Stephen is trying to bring up here.
it doesn't eliminate the problem of fine tuning. It just pushes it back one generation.
You know, how the problem with regard to the Big Bang. So a lot of folks have suggested that the Big Bang is not actually the beginning. So there is no in the beginning. There was prior universe that sucked in on.
Yeah, exactly, Ben. Wow, I'm actually like impressed that Ben has not been saying the dumbest things in the world
On itself and then blew out again. That basically time is eternal and there was no beginning to time necessarily.
Like he's actually asking decent questions here that I actually would like Stephen Meyer to be asked.
Early.
Well, there really aren't good cosmological models that eliminate what's called the singularity at the beginning temporally.
Yeah, because we don't know what to do there mathematically because we don't have quantum gravity.
The standard Big Bang or the inflationary cosmology model both terminate in a definite beginning. There've been
No, they don't.
a number of developments in theoretical.
Like they terminate in a singularity, which is not a definite beginning. It's like a point where our math literally breaks down. So no, it's the opposite of a definite beginning.
Physics that have reinforced that, the singularity theorem of Hawking, Penrose, and Ellis in 1968.
It still did not reinforce that, actually.
And also the a theorem independently in physics, the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem that established.
Yeah, the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem shows that inflation had a beginning, not the actual universe itself. You can check out my video where I debated Frank Turek, where I actually provide the quotes from two of those physicists themselves saying exactly that their theory does not say that the universe had a beginning. It says inflation had a beginning, and it's completely agnostic about whether or not the universe itself had a beginning.
To beginning. But what people have tried to do, what theoretical physicists have tried to do to get around the theistic implications of there being a beginning, is formulating a very abstract model of physics called quantum cosmology. That's where the action is.
Whoa. Stop the presses. Stop the presses. Jim Bob actually made something that I agree. He actually said something I agree with. You guys, what is happening in the world right now? Jim Bob said something correct. Yes, a singularity is a mathematical object, not an actual physics. Like it's not an actual physical object or physical reality. You have singularities that show up in fluid dynamics when you're describing a leaky faucet. Like I'm just shocked, guys. Like I'm just shocked. Jim Bob, well done. I have nothing else to say, sir. Let's continue.
Is if you want to get around the theistic argument for the existence of God based on the beginning of the universe. And I'm writing about this too. It's really heady stuff, but it's based on an analogy to quantum physics. And some of your listeners and viewers are very smart, so they might know about the weirdness of quantum physics. Where
oh my God, what a pandering little. Well, Ben Shapiro's audience, I'm sure, knows all about quantum physics. Like I'm sure that all of the quantum physicists, they all love Ben Shapiro's program. That's why every single theoretical physicist I've ever met and spoken to about politics is all extremely conservative and aligns with Ben politically. Exactly. It's not like every single physicist I've ever met is the exact opposite of Ben Shapiro politically. That's definitely not true at all. It is actually, yeah, that they're all left.
Particles act like waves and waves act like particles. So there's this thing called a wave function that describes all the different places that a particle might be, and then how it might collapse and manifest one particular set of attributes upon an observation. And by analogy, some of the physicists have said, well, maybe the universe came out of a bigger wave function, what they call a universal wave function.
It's not an analogy. Like Stephen is just like messing up so much here in his description of what he just said, but like he's literally just going through like a Copenhagen interpretation when there's other interpretations of quantum mechanics that don't change anything about the underlying physics. Your interpretation doesn't change anything about the physics. It's just sort of a philosophical lens to look at it through. But he's kind of ignoring all the other ones, and he's just going directly into saying that the universal wave function is an analogy when it's not an analogy. It's a mathematical, statistical description of the universe. Nothing analogous about that, Stephen.
Where there were all these different possible universes that were existing in what quantum physicists call superposition, sort of existing simultaneously in an abstract.
He's trying and bumbling to describe a wave function right now.
Mathematical space of possibilities, not as physical reality. And then somehow, some way, all those different possibilities collapsed, and we got a universe like ours. Okay.
Except if you're talking about other interpretations of quantum mechanics, like the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, in which there is no collapse. This collapse that he was just talking about it's not really a physical process. So he's kind of just, muddying the waters now for no reason. I have no idea where he's going for with this. So let's see.
Now, this is a very bizarre thing for a number of reasons. One, they've got a mathematical equation generating a material universe, which is a very not materialistic explanation of things. It's all
Yeah, I agree. Most physicists also agree and do not really consider the wave function to be an actual physical thing.
almost as one of the proponents of this, Alexander Volinkin, noted. He said, math is an idea that exists in mind. So when we say that the universe came out of a big universal wave function equation, are we really saying that the universe came out of a pre-existing mind?
No, you're not. That is not at all what's being said. And people are not saying that the universe came out of a universal wave function. Like, there is currently a universal wave function that describes the whole universe. And there was also back then. Like, there's the wave function of the universe evolves over time. So it's just a description of the universe. The universe did not come from a description of the universe. That doesn't make sense, Stephen.
He raises that as a rhetorical question near the end of one
And he knows it doesn't make sense too. He's just very confused about what he's talking about.
of his books, and then simply changes the subject to finish the book. The other crazy thing is that to get that mathematical equation that might explain our universe, you have to solve a prior mathematical equation, and you can't do that without an input of information which comes from the theoretical physicists. So like in those origin of life experiments, they're actually modeling the need for a mind.
Yeah, he's getting too ambiguous in general here. I don't know what he's talking about specifically, but I assume he's probably just wrong about it, because at this point, if we have learned nothing from the past 2 hours, it's that it's probably pretty safe to assume that this guy is wrong whenever he's talking about anything scientific. I mean, some things he has been right about, but by and large, the vastly more probable option is that he's going to be wrong if he's saying anything about science.
To generate information, and you get this weird conclusion. In the beginning was the word. You know? So it's very strange. The attempt to get around the theistic implications of the Big Bang have generated other models which themselves have implications that are very theistic.
Okay, so in just 1 second, I'm going to ask you a final question. I'm going to ask about your own religious background, where you come from religiously. If you want to hear Stephen Meyer's answer, you have to be a Daily Wire subscriber. To subscribe, go over to dailywire.com, click subscribe, and you can hear the end of our conversation there. Well, the book is Darwin's Doubt. The author is Stephen Meyer. Stephen, thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we covered it.
What a tease at the end there. Wow. I was not expecting it to end right there. What a wacky conversation. Well, there you have it. I honestly think that within just that less than an hour interview, but with Ben Shapiro of all people, that we really have debunked just about Stephen Meyer's entire philosophy. Like, everything that I have heard Stephen Meyer repeat over the years incorrect about evolution, the Big Bang, abiogenesis, science in general, basically everything wrong I've ever heard him said, he's somehow managed to jam every wrong statement into this interview right here. So that was the interview with Stephen Myers, and debunking a lot of actually, we debunked a lot of stuff that I've been wanting to talk about for a while now. We talked about the weighting problem. We talked about abiogenesis, fine tuning, the Big Bang. We really got a lot of ground here. So I thought this was a really great video. A lot of cool sites. We even talked about like a reducing versus oxidizing atmosphere and the reason why we need to breathe oxygen in the first place. So we really got a lot to cover here, and perfect. Mark Reed is here teaching me how to use YouTube, because Mark is a real professional YouTuber, guys. Subscribe to Mark. But yeah, so it was perfect. Thanks for everyone that came through it and was here for the debunking of Stephen Myers. I just want to put a few things on the horizon here, because I will be doing my first political debate soon on Modern Day Debates. It's going to be about Trump and whether or not Trump has been bad for America, which I think the question is pretty obviously yes. I don't think it should be that difficult of a debate, but I'm looking forward to it. You know, I figured it's 2024. It's a very political year. It's about time I dip my toes in the water, because there's a very weird overlap, guys. It turns out that almost everybody that I spend time debating on here, from flat earthers to creationists to climate change deniers, there's one thing that unites all of these people. And that's that if they live in America, they are almost all, if they are political, Trump supporters, which is, kind of weird. Kind of like maybe there's some big, huge confounding variable here that maybe there's a reason why all of these flat earthers and young earth creationists and evangelicals all flock towards Donald Trump. But yes, he's been very bad for the country, and I intend to argue such points. So it'll be my first like kind of big current political topic kind of debate. So I'm interested to see how it does, and if you guys enjoy that kind of thing on this channel. So definitely going to be paying attention to your feedback on that one. And then MDD also wanted me to do a debate uh, about whether gravity is existing. So pretty different Trump debate and then gravity debate. But you guys know I love that topic anyway. I love the whatever these adorable little flat earthers think that they can disprove gravity. It's so cute and fun and refreshing. So yeah, so that's what's coming up on the horizon. Look out for those two debates, as well as the video about my Wyoming trip and the cool dinosaur fossils that we found there. That's going to be coming on the horizon soon. And yeah, I might have a few other fun videos coming up in the next few weeks. So until then, stay tuned, keep listening, and stay curious and keep learning. Have a good rest of your night, guys. And it was a really fun stream to be back for. We got to cover a whole lot of stuff. And thank you again, I Killed Earl, for donating those memberships. You're awesome. Everyone that came through and listened tonight was awesome. I appreciate all of you guys. Good night.